Predator is a movie that is particularly close to my heart. I used to live with somebody whose entire vocabulary was quotes from Aliens, Robocop, some wrestling shows, and mostly Predator. So, if you're watching this, hi Mum. The Predator series at the moment consists of 3 films, with the earliest and undoubtedly the most iconic made in 1987, featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers. The second film was released in 1990, and the third film came out a whole 20 years later, in 2010. Now in 2018, a new film set between Predator 2 and Predators is scheduled for release. All the films are essentially about exactly the same thing: armed and able humans being hunted by a far better armed and seemingly far more able alien, or aliens, the Predators, or Hunters. As a series, I think it's maybe changed the most out of all of the series that I've looked at in terms of individual films. Rocky as a series changed a lot, but I think over the 7 films that comprise that series, it was kind of gradual. But the films that compose the Predator series all occupy different places in terms of tone. You'll see what I mean shortly. I hope. Anyway, Predator is about an elite team who are sent to somewhere in Central America on a black operation. They have to travel in civilian clothing, and you've got Johnny Cash and someone's swanky dad, a used car salesman, and a man modelling the Vincent and Jules emergency clothesline, and of course, Columbo. Of course, it's Schwarzenegger as Dutch, the head of an elite rescue team sent here to rendezvous with colleague-turned-CIA scamp, Dylan, played by Carl Weathers.
Damn good to see you, Dutch.
What is this fucking tie business?
Oh, come on, forget about my tie, man.
Yes, anyway, the reasons for the mission and the fact that the rescue angle is really all of a trick by Dylan to get Dutch's team to help him secure intelligence is really neither here nor there. It's not really about that. There's an action sequence where Dutch's men ambush a guerrilla outpost and where they capture a woman, Anna, who goes on with them and who, and this is where the spoilers start, is one of only 2 survivors. Can you guess who the other one is? It's not this guy. Anyway, this is all preamble for the main event. A single unseen enemy, the Predator, soon outmatches this elite commando unit. One by one they're killed, essentially by a sophisticated monster. Grisly and gory deaths abound, with plenty of blood. Ultimately, the Predator lets Anna escape, seemingly as she never presented a threat to it, and instead pursues the big game, Dutch. Ultimately, Dutch prevails, but only just, and even then he's almost consumed by a massive explosion that the Predator initiates to destroy itself. Predator was originally called Hunter. It was written by Jim and John Thomas, at least partly because of a joke going around at the time about Rocky IV, and about how in the next Rocky outing, Rocky would have to fight something like an alien. They took that joke as inspiration and wrote a speculative script. It ended up being directed by John McTiernan, who the following year would direct Die Hard. The Predator creature was devised by Stan Winston, the SFX whiz behind the Terminator and Aliens, and it was James Cameron who suggested to Winston that the creature have mandibles. As well as creating a now very recognisable antagonist, who at one point was set to be played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, who was later deemed to be not physically imposing enough, a lot of the fun in the first viewing of Predator is anticipating when we're actually going to see the thing. We have lots of hints, but we don't see anything of the creature until 40 minutes in, and then it's largely invisible. 50 minutes in, we see only some of it for the first time, and oh boy is it in need of a manicure. In fact, it takes about an hour and 7 minutes for us to see the Predator's head when it's not invisible, and even then it's wearing a mask. There are several occasions where we do see the Predator's vision, but I think keeping it strictly POV and with only cloaked appearances does wonders for both building tension but also building threat. What is this thing? It is totally believable as something that could run rings around even a very elite Special Forces unit because it can turn invisible and run through the treetops. The invisibility effect was created by chroma keying out someone in a bright red suit, then repeating the same shot, without actors, but 30% wider. Typically now we might expect that suit to be green or maybe blue, but the reason red was chosen was because of the jungle setting and because of the shots where you can see the blue sky. The Predator blood was made from KY jelly and the stuff that's inside glow sticks, which I think, if I remember correctly, is what you get if you take 1,000 fairies and crush them into pulp. Predator was nominated for an Oscar for its visual effects, and I'd argue they still hold up very well. Yes, the thermometric vision, the infrared, looks a bit dated, and so maybe does the way the Predator cloaks itself. But I think those effects have aged with the film. They aren't jarring, they work. The film made just over $98 million at the worldwide box office. With a production budget of an estimated $15 million, there had to be another. But also I think there had to be another because it really did engage its audience. I think it did so because it's great action, but also it has a simple but captivating story. Many critics at the time called it derivative, and I don't necessarily disagree. The characters aren't so much two-dimensional as they are secondary to the action, and to the Predator itself. There's even some technical issues. You can see that Arnold is obviously lit here, and the jungle entry clearly shifts between day and night. But I don't think these things matter. I don't think Predator did much different to other films of the same era. I think in film academics it isn't an important film, but I do think it is highly entertaining, and I do think it has an expertly crafted pace. And as I mentioned before, it is probably one of the most quotable films ever made.
Some damn fool accused you of being the best.
Dylan! You son of a bitch. We're a rescue team, not assassins.
The other day I went up to my girlfriend. I said, you know, I'd like a little pussy. She said, me too. Mine's as big as a house.
Payback time.
Yeah! Stick around.
You're bleeding, man.
I ain't got time to bleed.
It's all bullshit. All of it. My men are not expendable. Anytime.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no man.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
Only in the hardest years this happens.
Oh, don't! Leave it! He didn't kill you because you weren't armed. No sport. Get to the chopper! You one ugly motherfucker.
Do it! Do it!
Come on, come on! Kill me, I'm here! Kill me!
Predator 2 is an unusual sequel in that, on paper, it is very similar to the first film, but watching it, it often feels very, very different. Starting with a shot of what seems to be jungle but turns out to be LA, Predator 2 almost explicitly tells us it's going to subvert our expectations, but then really doesn't do that very much. In many ways, it seems the writers were very careful to duplicate the beats of Predator. It starts with a bit of side action, a gang war that again isn't really relevant to Predator hunting people down, but provides the setting. There's an elite team, this time it's cops, not soldiers, and there's even a jokey guy.
And the doctor says, I need a semen, stool, and urine sample. I say, gee, doc, I'm in a big hurry. Can I just leave my underwear?
Albeit a far more irritating jokey guy than before. Gary Busey's character, Keyes, in the same sort of vein as Dylan, is an ally, but also has his own agenda. People get picked off one by one, and the last act is all about Danny Glover's character, Mike Harrigan, battling a predator alone. That's right, there's no Arnie. Schwarzenegger isn't in Predator 2 because, it seems, he wanted $250,000 more than the producers were prepared to offer. I don't know the details behind the dispute, and such things are pretty common. But I think that the film would have done better, in all ways, if Schwarzenegger had been in it, even if Glover was still the protagonist. Anyway, the film does end quite differently. Glover slays the predator that has been stalking him and that's killed a good amount of cops and gangsters, and is presented by other predators with a trophy of his own. Ooh la la. There's a lot more hinted about what the predators are really up to. They obviously follow a set of rules, and things, I think, feel a lot less mysterious. People from Stan Winston's studio were still involved in the special effects, and Winston himself is credited. As well as there being a lot more time with the Predator on screen, as well as more than one on screen at once, I think the invisibility effect is greatly improved in Predator 2. And in many ways, I wish it had been used more. I'd argue that we see far too much of the Predator. There's also something I have to mention: the appearance of a certain trophy on the Predator ship. It is of course the skull of a xenomorph, the alien in Alien. This is at least partly responsible for 2 crossover films, Alien vs Predator and Alien vs Predator Requiem. And as I said in my video about how the Alien movies changed over time, I'm not going to talk about those movies here. They are, in my mind, their own entities. Their tone is completely different, especially to most of the Alien films, and there are a number of narrative inconsistencies. Really, they occupy their own universe. The appearance of the skull, I'd argue, doesn't mean Predator occupies the same world as Alien. It's an Easter egg, if you like. A friendly nod to a series many on Predator 2 had worked on. Predator 2 got quite a bad write-up when it came out, and I've always regarded it as a vastly inferior film to the first. But, having watched it again for this video, I now feel that it is entertaining, if just a little too long. About 20 minutes were cut to achieve an R rating, but even then, the end is bloated. There are weird tonal shifts in the film that make it hard to engage with at times, as if the director had just finished watching and really enjoying Robocop just before shooting. But at the end, there's a moment where the Predator falls into a bathroom, inexplicably administers first aid to itself despite being pursued, and then camply runs through someone's apartment, and it's all just a bit too silly. Not that I think that the first 2 films take themselves incredibly seriously. Predator 2, nevertheless, seems to have a bit of a nasty streak that's a bit more mean-spirited than the first film. But more than that, I think Danny Glover does a good job. He has quite a lot of on-screen presence, but he does play a character that's quite hard to like. We don't have much time to get to know the commandos in Predator, but they're more deserving of sympathy, I'd say, because of the one thing Predator 2 almost entirely lacks: the feeling of claustrophobia, of being trapped. In Predator, Dutch's men had to get to an extraction point to meet a helicopter. They had to escape. In Predator 2, there's no sense of anyone ever having to escape. The Predator feels as much hunted as hunter, and I think that really undermines the sense of peril. Predator 2 made a box office total of $57 million, but cost $35 million to make. If you consider prints and advertising costs on top of that, it really didn't make much money, and hence why a sequel wasn't immediate. But still, there were a number of ideas in the 90s about a third Predator movie. One, entitled The Zoo, was going to be about Schwarzenegger's and Glover's characters taken to the Predator homeworld, which sounds a lot like the film that was made, but with Schwarzenegger and Glover, and better. Call me negative, but I really feel as though this film needed one of those 2 actors. Adrien Brody has an incredible reputation as an actor, but I feel as though he was somewhat miscast as a grisly, growly mercenary in Predators, which is about some of the Earth's best combatants being kidnapped and set loose in what is basically a wildlife preserve. As well as Adrien Brody being the all-around hero, you've got your sniper. She's a lady, of course, because you need a lady, but she can't be anything but a sniper because you can't have a woman machine gunner, can you? Is that me being cynical or the film? You've got your Mexican with 2 submachine guns, your Russian with a minigun, your mysterious man in a suit, a nutjobber too, and essentially there's no story other than Team Fortress schlepping through the woods, getting murdered one by one. The group eventually comes across someone who survived long enough on what appears to be a safari planet to go mad.
Smelled you since you got here.
Lawrence Fishburne really is the best thing in the movie, not because the other actors aren't any good. Walton Goggins and Adrian Brody are very good actors, but because he actually has a character to play.
Well, between that and the sun, I'd say we have a real problem.
I'm the protagonist and my voice is very growly. Sometimes I look up at the moon and I think, moon. It's all just a little undirected. Brody doing the cliched Batman voice is, at least, a sign of lack of imagination on the director's part. It doesn't help that his character isn't very likeable at all.
You're gonna beg us to slow down, to carry you.
No. You can't leave me here.
Really, this all seems to be not only a great big cliche, but the worst kind of cliche.
It's because we are predators. Just like them. We're the monsters of our own world.
A cliche that takes itself way too seriously. The first two films may very well be conventional, but you can tell, even with the nasty moments in Predator 2, they never thought that they were deep or insightful. They never dressed themselves up to be like that. I think you have to respect that. They never pretended to be comments or to be reflections on the human spirit. They're action movies. They're fun. Anyway, the film ends with, surprise, surprise, Brody and the lady surviving, and there are a couple of references to Predator 1.
Yes. Come on.
But really, I'm not sure this is anything other than a cringy checking of a box. The film that Nimrod Antal has directed seems to be just that, and although it isn't really missing any core ingredient, it is very bland. Our old friends Amalgamated Dynamics, who were responsible for the effects in the Alien vs Predator movies, did not work on Predators. Instead, Greg Nicotero and Howard Berger created the Predator suits in Predators, Berger having helped Stan Winston on the first Predator film. I think the effects are good enough, although certainly some of the CGI occasionally looks a bit obvious, but it isn't present enough to be too distracting. In fact, the more I think about Predators, the less I have to say about it. It's by no means a terrible movie, it just seems to me very dull. There are so many characters, with so little on-screen time, that they remain one-dimensional. The Yakuza can use an ancient samurai sword because he's Japanese. I'm not sure I'd call Predators lazy as much as I'd call it uninspired, and I think that's basically what happened to this series. Predator is a fairly conventional action film with sci-fi elements that has a lot of interesting ideas. Its immediate sequel does expand on them, but for the most part it's very derivative. The interesting part comes towards the end when aspects of the Predator society are hinted at, but at the same time I think that those hints kind of, as I've said, ruin the mystery a bit. Predators loses even this. I mean really, I think doing a sequel 20 years later is usually a bad idea. Predators did do well at the box office, but I don't think it adds any ideas to the series. It might add a bit of detail about the Predators, but I think it's the lack of detail, the mystery, that makes the Predator so interesting. Like in the Alien series, I don't want to know where the xenomorph comes from. I think it's more chilling and more weird when we don't know where it's from and why it exists in the way it does. For both of these series, the important part is they're aliens and they're very good at hunting humans. The realization of the team in Predator that what the Predator is doing, it's doing for sport, is, I think, really enough. That tells us enough about what it is and why it's doing what it's doing. Everything else is superfluous and just really repeating that message. Also, I think Predator 1 and 2 worked better because for the most part there was a single hunter. And they were very much in control, although at times Predator 2 does lose this a bit. Ultimately, it seems to be a series where the more we know about the monster, the less interesting it is. Something I think isn't exclusive to Predator. The new film, The Predator, will surely reference the previous outings with mechanical timing, but I think it might struggle to refresh the series. But I hope it does. Personally, I'd prefer to see Schwarzenegger or Glover than a bunch of random fodder, but who knows. Thank you very much for joining me. Next time I'll be talking about studio interference, how it interferes with the creative process, and how it scuppers certain IPs, like the Fantastic Four. So, see you then, and don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Patreon, and Facebook, but not in real life. Thanks again, see you next time.
I'll get you next time, Gadget. I'll get you next time.